Good afternoon. We are now resuming the CEDAW hearings. That's the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women. Yesterday, we had a number of witnesses: Leonie Maguire on women's refuges, Michelle Fernando on family law, Barbary Clark on disability, Sally Gearan on criminal assault at home and other forms of domestic violence, particularly in relation to the importance of ensuring that Indigenous Australian women are properly protected and recognised, Marita Murphy on child sexual abuse, and Karen Baczynski-Lee on the film and media, women in film and media. And this morning we heard from Simone Watson on prostituted women, Jane Matz and Stacey Carter on family law, Jessica Williams on women in prison, Shemaine Weldon on rural and women living in remote areas, and Jenny Hocking on history and publishing. And we've had representatives from various states: New South Wales, South Australia, Victoria, the Northern Territory, and from Bani De Luca in Italy, one of our participants who, of course, is originally from Victoria and Western Australia. And now we would like to turn to Catherine Lynch, who is from New South Wales. So welcome, Catherine. We're here. There's Dr. Helen Pringle, Mary Kerr, Kerry Heubel, Bashi Kumar, who unfortunately can't be here this afternoon due to child illnesses, and myself, Jocelynne Scutt. Welcome, Catherine.
My evidence relates to the practice, the government-sanctioned and legislated practice of separating mothers and babies. And I'm talking about this in reference to the CEDAW's protection of maternity, of which, of course, having mother and baby together is very much a part of maternity. So the three areas on which they are separated are for child protection, and then the other two are for the family formation of other people other than the mother's family. So to create a kind of an artificial family as opposed to, and that's with adoption and surrogacy, not so much adoption anymore. So in CEDAW, this relates to the, in the beginning of CEDAW, it comes under the heading of family relations, which is in that list, list of issues that we were given. And in the preamble of CEDAW, it states that the state parties bear in mind the role of both parents in the family and upbringing of children. They're aware that the role of women in procreation should not be a basis of discrimination, and the upbringing of children requires a sharing of responsibility not only from mothers and fathers but from the whole of society. So that's in the preamble. And then there's a specific protection of maternity in Article 4, where it states that the adoption by state parties of special measures, including measures contained in the present convention, which are aimed at protecting maternity, should not be considered discriminatory. So going on from there, what sort of position are we in terms of protecting maternity as required by CEDAW? Just a bit about myself. I have a bit of experience in this area because I myself was separated permanently from my mother just after birth for the purposes of family formation, because my mother was a single woman in 1972, single mother. So we now call that the forced adoption era, and Julia Gillard apologised for the Commonwealth's role in that, because I think something like 250,000 people over the decades were taken. In my year, 1972, the peak year, nearly 10,000 babies were taken off single mothers, whereas today the adoption rate is about up to 300. So you're looking at a difference of 10,000 babies versus 300. So that's looking good. We're not separating babies for adoption as much, anywhere near as much. So I'm also a lawyer and I'm an activist in this field. I first became aware of the difficulties facing women because of separation in adoption and surrogacy, other than my own experience, for a couple of reasons. As an adopted person, the invention of the World Wide Web in the 1990s allowed us all to connect with one another globally. Before that, we were very isolated. So then we shared stories and realised just what kind of social phenomenon we were part of. The changing of adoption laws, which allowed us to access our original birth certificates, that was in the 1990s as well. And that allowed us to get our mother's name, sometimes our father's name, our own name. So my real name's, well, my name's Mary Ann Reinberger. And we were able to find out who we were, where we came from. And then the third thing was embarking on a PhD in literature, simultaneous with my journey to reunion with my mother. So I began to also research it while I was doing my PhD. And then I became aware of government inquiries and Senate inquiries that led to the apology by Julia Gillard in 2013. Okay, so considering Australia's obligation to protect maternity pursuant to CEDAW, there have been improvements that have reduced the practice of separating mothers and babies to form other people's families or to provide children for, I guess, infertile people or people who want to, who sort of feel like they're doing something good by adopting perhaps someone they think is orphaned. So this has been greatly reduced. So that's actually quite good. Whether that's specifically due to CEDAW or the Convention on the Rights of the Child, which came in the 1990s as well, around then, I think. So I'm not sure. But anyway, that's good. However, here's the bad news. While people in my position would like to say that there's only one ethical and moral position you can take on separating mothers and babies after birth, there's only one. It's a very simple issue. It's a very obvious issue. We know now, and we always did know, that separating mothers and babies is extremely damaging to both the mother and the child. And we know this not only through decades of animal studies, also sleep studies, and also testimony from people in the stolen generation, and testimony from people who contributed to the forced adoption era. So all of these testimonies testify to the intergenerational trauma that separating babies from mothers at or near to birth causes people. And I speak from experience. It's just really, really, really traumatic. But because it's happened so young, many people, many adopted people have a very good appearance of, a lot of us can appear quite capable. However, a lot of us don't, and we have high suicide rates, and also among mothers who've lost their children to adoption. So while we know this, and we actually knew this before the adoption boom in the 50s, 60s and 70s, but what happened is with World War II and all that, you know, the whole eugenics movement thing, it wasn't just the Nazis who were into eugenics. That whole philosophy, ideology went through, was I think it even came from the US. It was right through Australia. We had a eugenics society in a very vibrant eugenics society in Melbourne. And this all promoted the idea of a clean slate, and that babies can just be taken off mothers without damage. Look, we know that there's no argument at all, and yet, every state in Australia, or I think nearly every state, is now passing legislation that confirms, allows, entrenches this separation of mothers and babies for the purposes of surrogacy contracts. I really cannot, none of us can understand anything that distresses babies should only be done when you really have to do it. And so that's really child protection, isn't it? So, I mean, the only way that a mother and baby should be separated is child protection. People say it's okay that because the mother's consenting. First of all, any mother consenting in surrogacy, comparisons can be made to the mothers that consented in the forced adoption era. Those consents are coerced, the women are groomed. These things are, I've had personal experience knowing people that have acted as surrogates. A lot of them are now in court, fighting for access, fighting for compensation. What has to be done if we want to protect maternity is we have to repeal the adoption laws. Now, this doesn't mean we can't raise children in families if they've had to be removed from their own family for child protection reasons. We can do that without fabricating a birth certificate for them. We can do that without hiding the names of their parents by taking them off the birth certificate. So people like me, we've got 2 birth certificates. And if we never had access to the first one, we would have never found out where we came from and who our mothers were. This is happening in surrogacy. They're having they either get a parent or parental order, or they get adopted, and the same things are happening with their identity documents. So, like the donor conceived community, we are very much about making sure that people's birth certificates are not changed without their authority or their permission. We need them to reflect the truth of the identity at birth. However, that means really what we have to do is repeal all the adoption acts. That sounds a bit radical perhaps to people who don't know this area, but the the Adoption Rights Act, Adoptee Rights Action Group I'm part of, and the NGO I'm part of, we advocate for this. And really, there's only 300 per year, I really don't see much of a problem, except that there's still a market with overseas adoptions. So to try and stop intercountry adoptions is really difficult, because it is actually an international global trade in children. A couple of little kids were murdered in the United States just the other day. Happens quite frequently over there. But nobody hears about abused adoptees and murdered adoptees. It's the abused adoptees are very, very much have no voice anywhere. Nobody wants to hear them, because both the left and right of politics find it very difficult to give up the fact that if you can't have children, you might not have children, or you might not have a right to somebody else's child. So I would just say that, other than repealing all the adoption laws, of course, we have to outlaw surrogacy 100%, because it's bad enough being an adoptee, but I can tell you for nothing, if you are a child born under surrogacy, you're born under a contract, you are going to grow up knowing that you have been commodified, that you've been conceived for the purpose of that commodification. You are going to know you've made people a lot of money, you've made lawyers, doctors, fertility clinics a lot of money, and you have had your identity documents changed, you've had declarations about your parentage changed that don't reflect who your mother actually is. And we just need to go forward, to conclude, by outlawing surrogacy completely. And fortunately, unlike with adoption, where people sometimes think, well, what if you're a special needs child in a poverty-stricken country? Don't you think we should be able to bring them over to a more wealthy country, look after them? Unlike adoption, where there's this grey area where people really there's no grey area in surrogacy. We really are creating a generation of people who are going to be very, very upset. And like us, they're going to be demanding a national apology for the way they were brought into this world. only if they can get out of the socialisation and brainwashing that you get from birth. Because as an adoptee, you're brought up celebrating adoption. And if I try and say, if as an adoptee I'm saying, oh, adoption's terrible, well, you know what? I'd probably be made an orphan by my adoptive parents. I can't say that. It's you can't say that in the family, because your adoptive family is all you've got, and you can't say it in a family created by surrogacy. You can't turn on the people closest to you and say, "How dare you?" Right? So you're really socialized. Yeah, that's why people this age, like in my 50s, we're speaking, and you'll probably have to wait so long. I know there's some activists who were born under surrogacy contracts who are speaking out now, but I think you'll find that most of them are mute. They just can't speak. They can't stand up for their rights. They can't question their origins because, as we know from the donor conceived community, it's very difficult. Nobody wants to know because there's so much money involved. So I think that just about concludes. Is there anything else you needed me to say? I mean, I've told you how we need to change society. Repeal all the adoption acts and outlaw surrogacy, all forms of surrogacy, so that the only way mothers and babies are separated is if the baby is in danger.
Could I just ask something, Catherine?
Yeah.
About surrogacy? You see, there's a very large push from some quarters to say that as altruistic so-called surrogacy doesn't involve money and so forth, somebody, a sister says, well, I'll have a child for my sister, or the mother says, I'll have a child for my daughter, etc. So they would say that there's therefore no argument against altruistic surrogacy. So what would you say to that?
I'd say that any practice that separates mothers and babies. So I think I know of one family, the earliest family who tried surrogacy in Australia, one of the earliest. Between two sisters, they lived in the same house. I think you would have to say that the majority of surrogacy, all surrogacy involves separating mothers and babies. I mean, even if you're in the same house, the mother is not with the baby, breastfeeding the baby. So all surrogacy involves the separation of the baby from the mother. That is the crux of the matter. Once you start talking about money, that's all really bad. Once you start talking about the identity problems and all these other things, or the medical problems, these are all major issues. But you just can't get beyond the basics of the fact that a baby suffers without its mother, without the mother that gave birth to him or her and carried them. The baby actually is born in love with its mother. And it is absolutely devastating. I can't reiterate losing that mother. And you'd have to say 99.9% of surrogacy, the baby is not even in the same house as its own mother. So the separation still occurs.
I suppose too, do you think that part of the problem might be that when people think, right, an ovum and a sperm were united in a test tube and then put into this so-called surrogate mother, who's the real mother, that therefore there seems to be this idea that somehow it develops without having the nurturing and the natural components that are a part of pregnancy that develop the child. So therefore, though there's a foreign ovum and sperm, there's a body that's actually contributing to the development of the child from day one. Is that part of your issue in terms of that is the mother of the child?
I'm so glad you brought that up, Your Honour, because when we talk about the protection of maternity, we are talking about the protection of pregnancy. And when we're talking about pregnancy and birth, We're talking about the whole phenomenology of pregnancy. And this is not only is this the idea of what pregnancy is, the relationship that forms over that period, that whole extended time. It's people don't think of it in terms of what actually occurs. It doesn't matter. The baby has no idea that it's been implanted in the womb. It has no idea that its DNA initially is a different DNA. It doesn't have that idea. I think it's just so important to put yourself in the mind of the infant and to understand infant experience. Babies do not know they are under surrogacy contracts. They don't know they've been implanted as gametes or embryos. All they know is their holistic feeling of being one with their mother, whom they don't distinguish between themselves and mother for months after birth, do they? We know that. They believe they're part of her, and all its biological and physiological processes after birth are all directed to the mother that's just given birth. And these are all like survival mechanisms. So if you put a baby on the belly of the mum, I've seen videos, they wriggle up towards the nipple. Now, they don't put their head up and look for the donor in the room. They know who their mother is. Every single baby under a surrogacy contract knows exactly who their mother is. And not only do they know, they want her, they need her, and they love her. And if you take that baby from that mother, you are attacking the heart of human love. You are attacking the heart of human nature. And this has been developed in babies since the dawn of evolution, hasn't it? This is what babies want. So anyone who comes in and reaches for that baby, I can't tell you the power it makes people feel. That euphoria, the euphoria of receiving somebody else's baby, or a baby that you think is yours, or you say is yours because it's come from an initial gamete or an egg or a sperm, that baby you're taking, it's a euphoria, but that's a euphoria of power. The love is there in the baby for the mother that it wants. And that is why if you take a baby from its mother and give it to someone else, it cries for days and days. It refuses food. It refuses sleep. Its heart rate increases. I've got so much. I mean, I won't go into it, but I can tell you exactly what happens to the baby. Now, I've got records of how I reacted, and I was screaming night after night, refusing food. The reason I was screaming is I was calling to my mother. Now, all mammals do this. Kittens do it. Puppy dogs do it. And we have regulations in Australia that say we cannot remove puppies and kittens from their mothers because it's just so distressing to those mammals. Now, we are mammals. So it's just beyond me how a government can agree to this. And we just know that it's all about lobby groups and it's all about sense of entitlement.
Over to the panel. Any questions or issues that you'd like to raise?
I guess what comes to me is if we were able to legislate to ensure, based on the fact that the child and the mother are in love with one another, that should extend then into the family court when custody and issues like that, or even in jails, women are in jails, so that the children are not then removed. I mean, I'm extrapolating that out, but I've often wondered why men should have equal access to a child that has been tied to the mother emotionally over such a long period, even if she isn't, as society sees her, perceives her as a lovely woman. I see what you're saying as not confined to the issue of birth, but extrapolated through and beyond it as well, including, of course, yours.
Absolutely. We used to have a common law doctrine called the tender years doctrine, which recognised, I don't know if it did in practice, but it certainly in law, it recognised the special relationship that is unique between the gestational mother and the baby. And I think they changed that to best interests of the child. Now, really, the idea should carry over, because we know the best interests of the child is to be on the body of the mother.
It was overturned by the High Court in the 1970s, that doctrine, and it's interesting because the dissentient on the High Court at that time was Justice Lionel Murphy, who was the architect of the Family Law Act. And what he said is that they should not overturn that doctrine without doing proper research. And the Australian Institute of Family Studies was set up under the Family Law Act, and he said that before we change this and say mothers and fathers are equal in terms of the relationship with the early years, we need that research. And his judgment was a dissent. And the other judges were busy projecting this notion, oh, well, fathers and mothers are the same. There's absolutely no difference. And so you could say that early years was not founded in research, if you want to say that. But he was saying, well, then let's look at what the research is. It's interesting, that case.
Yes.
Yes. I think, Helen, you had something on that, a view on that too, didn't you? We were discussing that, the whole issue about the mother and the child in the early years. Yeah. Did you have any issue for Catherine?
Oh, what do they say? I'm furious agreement. But but I think it's going to be difficult. I think it's getting more and more difficult day by day to hold for this position and to maintain, like the surrogacy industry have more or less created this category of altruistic surrogacy, and they want to see commercial surrogacy as all commercial surrogacy is altruistic surrogacy. And I often say to people, look, commercial surrogacy is bad because it's commodification. Altruistic surrogacy is bad because you don't get paid. You get nothing. Yeah. You don't get the child. It's just pure slavery. And so, I think they're both as bad as each other, slightly different. I think they're but as you say, the same in the sense that in both a child is removed and a mother. I think the other thing is a mother is left bereft, and so we always talk about a child because we think we'll get more sympathy with that, and we do, and we should, I suppose. But it's also the mother is left with with a part of her missing, and
the mothers, yeah.
And the idea too that that period is just a period of baking, that the main period comes after. And I know I've said to people, children can hear things. Don't say those things about children, because children can hear things in the womb, and people laugh at me. I don't care. But it's as if the child, I know the child can't speak, and I know, but the child understands in ways, non-verbal ways. Yeah. One question that I did want to ask you is how this is also linked to breastfeeding, because it's kind of really, it struck me over the last year or so that there's a renewed assault on breastfeeding, and that people say things like, I was made to feel guilty for not breastfeeding, and I kind of thought, no, the person who what made you feel guilty was the formula industry, who are trying to inculcate this story about the creation of guilt by breastfeeding mothers. And you know, that it's a you know what it is. It's what an industry it is.
Absolutely.
And then the idea that men can breastfeed. Never mind.
What about
Mary? For that. It's deeply misogynist, and it's deeply anti-biology, and it's deeply misogynist. Yep.
Perhaps Mary, do you have any questions?
I was just going to talk about obviously the trauma that it obviously leaves behind for the baby, and then obviously the mum as well. But the child growing up, and then like you said, like your own experiences. There's so many, and then there's no services available, and they don't want to recognise the impact that it's had on your life.
No.
It's just tragic.
I think, can we come to also, we'll need to conclude in a moment or two, but also you raised in your paper the issue of knowing also your origins in terms of potential health issues. And that if you change the name on the birth certificate, then you actually cut off that human being from knowledge that's crucial. I mean, if we go to the doctor and we have a GP, we expect the GP to have a record of, and the GP can get the record from somebody who you had as a child, etc. But with it, and that's when you know who your parents are, they can get that record too. But here, the doctors are being, they're being deprived of actual knowledge about their potential patients.
Yeah.
I think you made that point.
Yes, so this is definitely a major issue. The reason I don't particularly discuss it is because all surrogacy should be outlawed anyway. But yes, this is just an extra problem. And as we know, the donor conceived community have had the same problem with their information on their birth certificates. And we know they've had one activist who actually, she did pass away from a particular cancer that had she known her parents, her donor, she would have certainly been able to prevent that. And they've been campaigning for years and years and managed to get some changes. But I mean, this issue, I could talk a lot about it, but I just think, what's the point, especially as there's an international organisation called CHIP, who have decided that they're going to take this particular thing about identity and make it the major thing. Oh, let's protect baby's identity when we put her in a little package, put her on an aeroplane and export her to another country to create somebody's family. But let's just make sure she knows who she is. Well, I'm saying I don't even have to go to that problem of identity because she shouldn't be on that plane being exported in the first place. So, yes, medical history, it's just part of a range of issues. However, my point to people thinking about CEDAW and the protection of pregnancy and maternity is that breastfeeding, the whole 9 months of pregnancy, breastfeeding, everything after birth, postnatal, all of that is a really 2-year phenomenon, 3-year phenomenon. That needs to be protected. And that's what's not protected if we have legalised surrogacy in Australia.
And your PhD was on this topic.
It was on literature, but because I was going through reunion and meeting my my biological family, my mother who gave birth to me, I began to look at the separation of mothers and babies in literature, and then I started looking at the history of adoption, and so I've researched a lot of adoption, and I've just been witness to this huge attack on biology and women. I mean, we were an attack on biology. Our mothers were disposable. They were completely erased off our birth certificates, and before the 1990s, we were not allowed to know who she was. And so the generation of adopted people before me, I had a teacher, she was adopted. I saw her, she died of cancer, and she was in that generation that weren't even allowed to know who she was and where she came from. She didn't know her name, she didn't know her mother. And our government's done that to us. And hey, it's allowing people to do it again because there's no protections for us. Even in this new, I mean, the whole adoption thing, they're saying we're having a birth certificate with both our mother and our adoptive parents on it. They're doing this thing. It's not a legal document, I don't think, but there's nothing to actually force these parents that acquire children to tell their child that they're adopted or removed from their mother under a surrogacy contract. We don't have anything that protects that. However, I mean, I wouldn't fight for that protection because I'm fighting to outlaw it.
Goodo. Well, look, thanks so much, Catherine.
Thank you.
Yeah, we really appreciate very much your submission and the opportunity that we've had to speak with you and have you here with us today. So many thanks. Good.
Thank you.
Thank you.